Chapter 8. The American City, New York. Early the next morning, Joe put on his leather trousers and shirt, washed his face at the spring, and left. He walked toward the white man's city. These were not his people, but at least they were people. Joe wanted a human voice. The language was unimportant. He would learn their words. He was ready to join the new men on their terms, just to be included again among human beings. At first he walked among the woods and hills that he had always known, but when he reached the mainland, the trees began to thin. Now and then he passed farms and buildings. Soon the road became a broad street, and he began to see people, first one, then two or three, and finally many. They looked at the boy in strange ways, as though they couldn't imagine what or who he might be. Two Trees walked faster, trying to avoid any contact. He knew it must come, but it frightened him. The people wore strange clothing and looked very different from him. Maybe this was the reason they peered after him as he passed. The boy was afraid, but his resolve was strong. He felt this fear among other men. The fear that waited back at the island was fear alone, fear that would grow during the winter to become a terrible beast and devour him. He walked at a brisk pace in a direction where he could see smoke rising into the sky. The white man's village must be large to have so many campfires. The streets were different here. They were paved with square stones. Now large wagons rumbled over the stones, pulled by teams of horses. People were everywhere here, and all were rushing to and fro. The boy thought this must be a harvest or something like it. Everyone carried boxes or bundles from one place to some other, and returned to get the next one. Piles of boxes were built in a certain spot, only to be dismantled and hidden inside wagons. Then new wagons would come, and their contents would be made into piles where the others had been. It was very confusing. The boy tried to understand, but the purpose of all this work eluded him. He could recognize, though, that it was work, and Two Trees was no stranger to that. He stood and watched until the system began to form a pattern. Each man carried when ordered to by one who stood on a platform and made marks on a paper. The buckskin-clad boy watched until he was sure he had made no mistake. The man with the paper was boss. Two Trees was sure now. He knew that a boss could pay for work done. He would make the boss understand that he wished to work for pay. He started toward the platform, but then, abruptly, everyone stopped working. The boss said a few words to the men and walked into a large building. The workers all picked up coats from a pegged board on the platform's end and left. Joe was disappointed that he had not been able to join the workers. He walked around the vicinity for a while to familiarize himself with the strange streets and alleyways. It was beginning to get dark now. He would need to find a spot to camp, and quickly. He rounded a corner and looked down the long street ahead of him. Something amazing had happened here. On a tall pole at each corner burned a tiny fire. He stopped and watched one for a long time. It flickered and flared, but he could not tell what it was burning. He noticed that the light did help him to see things better, though. He shrugged his shoulders at the strange occurrence and walked on. Later, he found an alley between two dark buildings. At the end of it, he could see the outline of trees. This would serve as well as any other place of the city, thought the youngster. He walked into the deep shadows, and dogs began to bark nearby. He stood still and soon they stopped. He reached the end and saw that it was a good place. If danger should come from the street, he could escape between the trees. Scraping together a mound of leaves, he sat and listened to the strange sounds of white man's night. A dog barked, a cat screeched, a wheel ground against stone, a man yelled, a door slammed. The boy huddled into his nest of leaves. Hunger began as a persistent pressure in his belly, and it pulsed stronger as the minutes passed. He hadn't eaten since the previous night, and now he was becoming aware of it. He took some maize bread and a bit of dried fish from his pouch and ate. Water stood in a small puddle nearby, and he drank. He reflected that on the next day he had better find paying work, for the pouch would not provide many meals. Tired from the long walk, the boy soon dozed, but he woke every few moments. New sounds and strange smells assailed the forest boy, and sleep would not overcome his senses. At the time when the shadows are deepest and night is at her darkest, the boy stood up. Some infallible clock, born of years under an open sky, told him that gray would soon appear in the east. He put everything back as it had been and walked in the street. He looked back and made certain no sign remained of his encampment. He wanted this place to remain his secret. He felt he might use it for a long time. He walked to the street where he had watched the men move boxes. When the eastern light had only begun to chase the dark, he saw the man who was boss walking toward the platform. The Indian ran up to him, and with many signals and pantomimes made his case for a job. The man seemed pleased. Two Trees didn't know it, but the day was Sunday. The boss knew that after a holiday, a full work crew seldom showed up. He told the boy to come back the next day and work. When the other men arrived, the boss said some words that the boy couldn't understand, and all began to move boxes. The Indian hurried to join, and soon he was a part of the general confusion. The workers often laughed at him and said, "Indian Joe," but he laughed with them. Soon he had a new name. Now he was Joe. He was pleased when he understood that this was a white man's name. Joe worked hard, and the boss hardly yelled at him. He arrived earlier and moved more boxes than the others. When the lunch break came, the men would often give him bits of food from their meals. They taught him words, and his young mind learned them quickly. After 6 days, the boss told him the next day was no work. He handed Joe $3 silver and told him to come early on Monday. Joe went walking to find a store. He was hungry and had money to pay for food. He wanted to find a place to buy corn or beans or maybe even fish, but all the stores were closed. At last he passed a window and saw people sitting at tables, eating. Joe entered and sat at one of the many tables. He didn't know much about restaurants, but he knew that money was in his leather pouch. A woman came, and Joe finally understood that she wanted to know what food he would have. He became confused. He showed her the $3, and then he remembered a word the men had taught him. "Sandwich," he told the woman. Time passed, and she brought a cheese sandwich and took Joe's $3. He tried to complain, but knowing no words, he took the woman's arm and tried to grab the money. A big man ran up and pulled at Joe. When he turned, the man hit him. Then the man threw Joe out the door onto the hard street. The door opened again, and the man threw the sandwich at Joe. The boy could hear cruel laughter behind the door as he picked up the parts of his sandwich. Joe took the food and walked toward his alley. It was Saturday night, and music came from many doors. People laughed and drank beer, talked, and enjoyed the eve of their day off. The boy was not a part of any merriment. When he came to his alley hideaway, he took the flint knife from inside his shirt and carefully cut the sandwich into 6 pieces. These would be his meals during the week to come. Tonight, he would not eat. Sitting in his little den of leaves, he held his knife and watched the way light glinted from its edges. Each chip was a tiny facet, giving the long blade a sparkling life of its own. Eagle feather had made the knife. Joe pressed its hard side against his cheek and tried to make it help him remember the old time. It was good having his father's knife. The hard stone was a link between the now and the then. He fell asleep with the Indian knife resting on his face. He woke early and set out to explore. Around the outskirts of the city he found fields with scallions and wild carrots growing. He filled an empty stomach with these, the things he knew. He took some and filled his pouch. At least he wouldn't starve. A sandwich and these would assure it. Having made this new discovery, he returned to the alley to put the roots on the ledge where he had left the sandwich. From the mouth of the alley he could already see that something was moving near his spot. He ran into the shadows and saw a pack of rats scurrying from the spot where his sandwich had been. Gone was the product of his first week's work. Evening came. The boy ate some of his roots and slept. He woke early. He had had a dream, but it was gone now. When he first opened his eyes, he had remembered it, but it soon was lost. He thought and tried to recall, but it was a part of the dream world again. He thought it might have been about the old time, though, because it left him very happy. With a smile on his face, he arrived at work. The camaraderie and activities of the day made him feel that he would find a place in this new world, a place for Joe. He worked hard, and the days passed. The men still gave him food at lunch, and at night he ate the roots from nearby vacant lots. He learned many new words, and by the end of the week he was able to say, "I thank you, boss," when he was paid. It was Saturday night again, and $3 were in the pouch. This time, thought Joe, he would be smarter. Taking 2 of the shiny coins, he buried them under the trees in his alley. This would be his store of money, just as his father had taught him to put aside a store of food. If hard times came, he would know he was prepared. He took the single dollar and walked out to the street. Finally, he found what he wanted, a small general store. He looked through the glass, and a man sat within, playing music on an instrument Joe had never seen. Later, he discovered that it was a violin. Only a small lantern cast its feeble glow, and the boy thought the store was closed. He tapped hesitantly at the window, and the man looked up with a smile. He motioned the boy to enter and walked toward the door. When the man spoke, Joe realized that he, too, used these American words only as a newly learned tongue. The shopkeeper seemed unconcerned at Joe's odd clothing, and this put the boy more at ease. He offered coffee, and the Indian accepted. It was a dark and bitter potion, strange to his mouth, but it was hot. He joined the man near an iron wood-burning stove, and they drank. With no small difficulty, they surmounted their language problems, and the man told of his country. His family were farmers in a place named Italy. Although they were poor, they had saved enough money to send him to this new America. He had used the last of the money to buy this small store and worked to save enough to bring his family here too. Joe felt a warm kinship with the man. He too had left his place to come to the strange city. The man said his name was Tony, and they each had found a compatriot. The boy bought a round of cheese, a large loaf of bread, and several other items of food. Tony took the dollar from the boy's extended hand and returned several smaller coins. Seeing the confusion on Joe's face, the man tried to explain change. The boy didn't understand it at all, but he learned that this Tony was an honest man. The weeks passed, and the hidden store of money grew steadily. Each week Joe would buy his meager needs from the shopkeeper and hide the rest of his pay. Tony and Joe would often sit late at night and puzzle over the strange ways of these Americans. Joe was the only one who had come from this land, but oddly, thought the two, no one saw him as an American. During this time, Tony taught Joe the rudiments of counting and arithmetic. He sold the boy new clothes at prices that could only have been less than he had paid. He provided company, companionship, and maybe that was most important of all. One Saturday, when Joe was finished work and on the way to his alley with the pay, 3 men watched from a bar room across the street. They knew it was payday and had spent all their own money. The 3 eyed Joe and sized him up as an easy mark. They slipped into the falling gloom and followed. Joe had become confident in his routine. He worked. He visited Tony, and he went to the spot that had become home. No one bothered him. He had no reason to suspect followers. He was anxious to put the money in his spot and then join Tony for coffee and talk. Joe didn't think to look behind him. The men watched him enter the alley. This was perfect. If they had been able to choose their spot, they couldn't have chosen a better one. One of them circled to the building's rear to cut off any escape. The other 2 entered from the street with knives in hand. Joe saw these 2 silhouetted against the dim gaslight. The rock cover was off his money hole, and the men had seen it. He knew he could only fight now. Flight was impossible. They would steal his stored dollars. He drew the flint knife from inside his coat and stood ready to meet the 2. He braced in preparation for their attack, and suddenly pain shot through his shoulder. He hadn't seen the 3rd man, the one who stabbed him from behind. He turned and instinctively drove his stone blade into the attacker. He caught the man in the center of his rib cage. Thrusting upward, the knife ripped into his heart. The man was dead before his body crumpled onto the hard ground. The only sound was a low, guttural grunt as the flint found its target. The 2 others saw the body and quickly thought better of their plan for an easy mark. They turned and ran from the place, yelling for the police. Joe had no time to think. He knew this place had served its final purpose for him. Scooping the dollars into his pouch, he fled through the trees. The last thing he heard was the barking of the dogs. He wondered, with a small part of his mind, if they were the same ones that had welcomed him to this alley 6 months before. The rest of his mind was occupied with one single thought. What will I do now? Alone, in trouble, and afraid, he thought of his one friend, Tony. He quickly headed to the haven of his shop. The man was there. Seeing blood on Joe's jacket and sleeve, Tony brought him inside. He looked up and down the street and, satisfied that no one had pursued, lowered the shades of his store. The man calmed the Indian and helped him to clean off the blood. He washed the shoulder wound and bandaged it with clean rags. It was deep, but it appeared a clean cut, and Joe was a strong young boy. He would recover. The boy said that now he was a brave, as his ancestors had been. He had killed his first enemy and received a blood wound in the fighting. Now, he said, I am Joe Two Trees, warrior. Tony found little to make sense of in this logic. He told Joe that, brave or not, he must now flee to a place of safety. The men would identify him easily, and soon police would find him. They would lock him in a metal cage, and after some preliminaries, hang him from a rope until he was dead. Joe protested that he had not struck first. He had killed the man only to save himself and his dollars. Surely they would not hang him for this. The crime had not been his. Tony laughed. He told the boy that the men would have many friends. These would be the witnesses and jury at his trial. Joe would have no one to speak for him except an Italian shopkeeper, unsure of the language at best. His fate would have been decided long before Joe saw the inside of a courtroom. The boy eventually saw the truth of Tony's irrefutable words. They agreed that he must leave now. Where he should go was the next issue. Still firm in his hopes for a place in the white man's world, Joe would not return to his island. Tony had an uncle who had come to America years ago. They had not seen each other since both had lived in Italy. The uncle had written once that he owned a small farm at the end of Staten Island. It had been years since Tony had heard anything from this man, but it was all he could think of for the boy. He told Joe his uncle's name, and making a rough map, explained where he lived. Tony wrote a letter in Italian, explaining things and asking his uncle to help the boy. Joe put it in his shirt. It was time to leave. The shopkeeper made food and gave it to the boy for his trip. Joe opened his bag of dollars, but Tony said he wanted no payment. The boy insisted, saying that the heavy silver would only slow him down. Finally, Tony took half, agreeing to hold it until the Indian could return to the city and claim it. The boy went into the night and made his way across a sleeping city. Near the lower end of the Hudson River waterfront, he found a boat tied at a wooden wharf. It had oars and seemed to be small enough for one man to row. Joe stepped in and untied the rope. He reached into his pouch and stacked $3 on the dock. This would be ample payment, he thought. Joe rowed out into the current of a mighty river, where once his ancestors had seen a strange new ship from a different land. The river was dirty and full of garbage. The Indian was wounded and fleeing for his life.